talking about the same thing. So again, if you're behind, just pick up where we are now. And it's okay. You can go back and read the stuff you missed later. But I want this to be a communal fellowship type of thing. There are hundreds. You do a Google search, you get different numbers. 600-ish, let's say. 600 plus laws in Exodus through Deuteronomy, the law of Moses. The first 10 are called out as special several times. We have the first 10 in Exodus 20. They're repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and 5. But as we go through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of laws, it is these first 10 that are called out as a special thing. Exodus chapter 25, verse 13. You shall make poles of acacia wood, overlay them with gold. You shall put poles into the rings on the side of the ark to carry the ark by them. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. And you shall put into the ark the testimony that I shall give you. What is this testimony where you're thinking you got 600 laws? If they had a nice little codex paper, maybe we could fit all those laws in the ark, but that is not the intent. Exodus 34, verse 27, the Lord said to Moses, write these words. In accordance with these words, I have made a covenant for you and with Israel. He was there for 40 days and 40 nights. He ate neither bread nor drank water. He wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. Now, the covenant given through Moses, the covenant at Sinai, encompassed, again, hundreds and hundreds of laws. But distilled down, put into the ark, were these 10. These special 10 at the beginning. Deuteronomy 4:11. As Moses is recalling this, far later on, they're about to enter the land of Canaan. Moses says, you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, that's Sinai, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but saw no form. There was only voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you the statutes and the rules, that you might do them in the land that you're going over to possess. And we think about these 10 commandments. We're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about some of the primary differences between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. Next Sunday night, next week, Sunday night, we're going to talk about the purpose of the law of Moses. Why did God give the law? Next Sunday morning, we're going to talk about God's character in the law. And obviously, these 10 are insufficient to bring about all the behavior that God desired. They don't encompass the entire law of Moses, right? The 10 Commandments don't say anything about sacrifice or feasts or holy days. I say they do have one holy day, that's the Sabbath. But like the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, none of that's in the 10 Commandments. Nothing of the tithes and the offerings to the temple. None of that's in the 10 Commandments. Nothing of the priesthood. We got Levitical priesthood and who can be a priest and consecrating the priests. We can think about the 2 greatest commandments from Matthew 22. We'll read this at the end, but Matthew 22, 36 through 40, Jesus asked, what are the greatest commands? Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. These aren't in the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments, we should not have this idea that these are sort of the all-encompassing be-all, end-all of the law of Moses. But they are a great summary of God's expectations for the individual. And one of the things that makes the 10 Commandments especially, I think, so significant, as you think about the sacrifices, the feasts, the tithes, the offerings, the priesthood, those are all things that went away. The 10 Commandments, at least in their general form here, have continued into the way that God expects people to live today. Really split into 2 categories. First, how people relate to God, and second, how people relate to each other. And as we talk about these 10 Commandments, we're going to go through all 10. This is an overview. We're not going deep on any of them. But as we go through these 10, again, thinking about the division here, how we relate to God, how we relate to other people, and thinking about, these are still things that God expects of us. Things that God expects us to do. For the first 4 commandments then, the positioning of Yahweh at the center of the individual's focus, worship, and loyalty. You can divide these into the first 4, and then the second 6 as we're thinking about relating to God, relating to other people. Exodus 20, verse 1. God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down or serve them. For I, and this is one of the things I really want to focus on, these first 4 commandments here. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation, to those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands who love me and keep my commandments. Now, in case you got the wrong idea, right? You shall have no other gods before me. Well, what if I have other gods? They're just not before Yahweh. God clarifies it later in Exodus 23:13. Pay attention to all I have said to you, and make no mention of the names of other gods, nor let it be heard on your lips. It's not just don't have any gods before me. Don't have any other gods. There are no other gods worth mentioning other than me, Yahweh. He is a jealous God. He demands and expects and deserves our full loyalty and attention. No other gods before me. It's not like you can worship God and then worship somebody else. Like, this is my sub-God right here, my secondary God. No, there's no secondary God. There is one. He is the only one. And he deserves all of your loyalty and attention. No carved image, no graven image, no icons, no idols, none of that. And of course, not ironic, unfortunate maybe, 12 chapters later, what do? Moses up on the mountain for 40 days. Long time, if you haven't read the story in a while. It's not like he just goes up there for a day and then comes back down. He's up there 40 days, and the people immediately, they're like, oh no, what are we going to do? I know, Aaron, make us a calf. Right? Literally, like the first thing they do when they're not sure what to do, let's make an idol. You will have no other gods, no graven image, no carved image. And of course, we think about James 4 as we're thinking these things continue into today. James 4, verse 4. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Do you suppose it is to no purpose that Scripture says he yearns jealously over the Spirit he has made to dwell in us? That we're jealous. He's going to say later on in the 10 Commandments, the last commandment, you shall not covet. And in some ways, jealousy, coveting, is like, what is the difference between those? At least as it relates to God. God only desires that which belongs to him. Because everything belongs to him. And especially the people of Israel, who he brought out of the land of Egypt, who he saved with a mighty hand, who redeemed them with great acts of judgment. You are mine. You're not Ra's or Anubis's or Baal or Ashtoreth. You're not any of those other gods. You're mine. And again, we think about our context here. We just commemorated the Lord's Supper, the sacrifice that leads to our salvation. We belong to him. And when we spread our loyalty, we spread our affection and allegiance, we evoke jealousy in God because we belong to him. The 3rd command, Exodus 20, verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. The 3rd command is where the Lord becomes a strange. I know I'm harping on this a lot, and I'm going to try to tone it down a bit. The 3rd command where the Lord becomes a strange translation choice again, doesn't it? It's kind of weird. I think many Christians typically apply the idea of this command, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, to the word God, right? Don't say, oh my God, or oh my gosh, which I think is fine. That's fair to think about, but that's certainly not the intent of this verse. This verse, God is a type of being. Do not take the name of the Lord, and we've said this already, right? The word Lord, Yahweh. Do not take the name of Yahweh your God. God is a type of being. It's not a name. Remember in Exodus 23, we just read it. Don't make any mention of any other names of any of the other gods. God was a type, a class, a kind of entity, not a name. Don't take the name of Yahweh your God in vain. And most English Bibles use the Lord, but I don't think many Christians typically think about the Lord when they think about this command, right? Don't take the word the Lord in vain, and I think rightly so. We don't really think of it that way. Sometimes we think of God that way. Not that I'm saying you should use the word God flippantly. Not that I'm saying you should just be cavalier in how you use the word God. But again, that's not his name. But more specifically, I think there's a more serious point to this. If you remember from our study of Ezekiel, I don't know, many months ago, the importance of considering his name to be holy and how we think about him and how we act reflects on his name. This command, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, an appropriate translation would also be, do not carry the name of the Lord your God in vain. That is, as you're living, you claim Yahweh as your God as opposed to Baal or Asherah or the gods of the Philistines or the gods of the Egyptians or whoever. You're claiming Yahweh as your God. How you live reflects on him. We read this in Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel 20 verse 13, I said I would pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness to make a full end of them, but I acted for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. Chapter 36, I had concern for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations to which they came. How did they profane the name of God? Because they refused to obey God. They were living just like the rest of the nations. They were living just like everyone else, and that made their God look worse comparatively. And again, we come to our own context here. You bear the name of, not Yahweh, although we still worship Yahweh. We bear the name more commonly of Christian. As we associate with Christ, we claim Christ, we claim God, Yahweh. How we act reflects on his name. How we live affects how other people think about the God that we serve. And so Israel here, part of the command in Exodus chapter 20, and they really took this to the whole extreme, but part of the intent of here that he's talking about, how you live matters. And it's going to matter as you go into the land of Canaan, you go into the land with all these other peoples and gods. You are to be special. Be holy as I am holy. The Sabbath command, Exodus 20 verse 8. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, or the sojourner within your gates. Now, there's interesting things. In Exodus 20, the motivation, the reasoning for this command, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In Deuteronomy, when Moses is recalling this later in Deuteronomy 5, it's a different incentive, different motivation for the Sabbath. This is the motivation in Deuteronomy 5:15. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. Well, which is it? It's both. The Sabbath is not only following in the model of God, the day of rest, but really, I think the intent in Deuteronomy chapter 5, God brought you out with a mighty hand. You have a day to think about that, to reflect on what God has done for you. The Sabbath was a time to reflect on his name, his holiness, their relationship with him, and the Sabbath commands are among the most repeated throughout the law of Moses. You're going to read Leviticus this week. I believe in you. You can do it. We're going to read Numbers. We're going to keep going into Deuteronomy. One of the things you're going to note, Sabbath comes up a lot. A lot. God repeats this idea because it's important. It's important that we take time regularly to think about God. We're removing all that. We use this phrase, remove the distractions from the world. Essentially, that was the Sabbath. You're taking a day off. You're not doing work. You're not doing regular stuff. What are they supposed to fill their time with? Well, they're going to be thinking about God and his holiness. They're going to be thinking about their place in his kingdom. And while we don't do it on the seventh day, we come to the New Testament, there's not like they repeated the Sabbath command for the Gentiles. The Gentiles are never commanded to take the seventh day off. The Gentiles are never instructed to do this. But there is a day, isn't there? A day to devote to God, to think about him, to reflect on your place in his kingdom, to remember what he's done. Deuteronomy chapter 5, you're going to keep the Sabbath because God brought you out of Egypt. Therefore, he said, keep the Sabbath. For us, it's this, isn't it? We're remembering and thinking and dwelling upon what he has done for us, taking time to consider our place in relation to him. The remaining commands, as we switch over here, switch to our relationship with other people. We spend 4 commands thinking about our relationship with Yahweh. He is the center of our lives. He is the one who has our full allegiance. We take time often to think about him, to reflect on him. And then the rest of this is how we treat one another. Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land the Lord your God is giving to you. When this is repeated in the New Testament, we're instructed to do this again, because this is the command with a promise, right? All the other commands are important, but this is the one that God ties a promise to. Honor your father and mother that your days may be long in the land. Why would that be? Because it is through the family teaching, and there's a lot of instructions we'll talk about throughout Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. The family unit was going to be the primary vessel by which God's instructions and loyalty passed from generation to generation to generation. And time again, you think about the book of Judges, think about the story of the kings, whatever you want to look in the Old Testament. Time and time again, it's another generation that comes up that doesn't know the Lord. It's not said in the text, but the implication is, whose fault was that? It was because they did not have this strong teaching, in large part, in the home. Not all the time, but a lot of times. Do not murder. Well, murder's another interesting one, because he's going to talk about all the different ways they need to go kill all the people in the land of Canaan. We're not going to unpack this a lot at length today, other than to say there's a specificity here about killing. Do not murder, especially those who are innocent, those who are undeserving of death. And there's going to be a lot of laws in the Leviticus and Numbers about what about when people are killed accidentally, and how do we deal with that? And what about when there's intentional killing? It's just, the other guy's put to death. But when there's accidental killing, what do we do about that? Do not commit adultery. And again, it seems weird, considering we're going to read in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy a bunch of different commands regarding marriage and sexual mores that are a little bit different than what Jesus teaches in Matthew and through the Gospels. Why was this such an important command? Again, tying it back to it, the father and mother, tying it back to the family unit as the sort of the central idea, the central way of communicating God's commands in Israel. The family unit was going to be that vessel. You shall not steal. We're going to see a lot. Actually, we'll put both of these up here, because you shall not steal. And then the next one, not only do you not take your neighbor's stuff, don't even want your neighbor's stuff. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, his male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, anything that is your neighbor's. Don't take it. Don't even covet it. Don't even desire it. Now, there's a nuance here. Your neighbor got a really awesome, in their context, let's say, a really awesome cow. Your neighbor has a really awesome ox. Maybe you want an ox, right? I would like an ox like that. But there's a very fine line here. Don't want your neighbor's ox. It's fine that your neighbor has one, and it's probably even fine that you want one. Don't want his. He has his, and maybe you're going to get your own. That's fine. But the desiring your neighbor's leads to the previous command, right? Stealing. Do not steal. And then the last one here. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. This is a legal thing, like you're thinking about we come to disputes before the priest or before God or before the courts. You're lying against your neighbor. But, of course, we're going to see throughout the commandments in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, God cares about truth. He cares about his people being truthful. And so we see some themes that are going to be repeated. The significance of family, right? Submission to parental authority, marital loyalty. Again, these are things that are just as present throughout the New Testament, things that God cares about. The value of human life. There's going to be a lot of detail about how restitution should be made for various kinds of killing as well as injury, and how we think about human life and what the consequence of taking it is. There's a lot of things established here that we're going to see repeated. Respect for property and ownership. If you've read any of Leviticus already, you've read through Exodus a little bit, there's a lot of commands about you see a neighbor's ox wandering down the street, or you're sharing a thing, somebody loaned you a thing and it was lost, or somebody loaned you a thing and it was broken, and he just goes on and on and on. There's a lot of commands geared toward property rights, ownership, and how to deal with disputes over things that can be owned. We're going to see that over and over. And then lastly, the importance of truth. Again, bearing false witness implies a judicial setting, but there's many commands that are going to be in the broader context of simply lying or saying false things. And I want to emphasize this again. God's expectations in the Ten Commandments. I think one of the things, again, that separates the Ten Commandments from the rest of the law of Moses, these kinds of expectations haven't changed. It's not like we come to the New Testament now, these things are off. Now, there is a lot of stuff in the law of Moses that we don't do. I'm so thankful that I don't have to offer a sheep every day. Can you imagine that, guys? We'd have an altar out back, and we'd go and offer just the amount of blood, the amount of the stench must have been just incredible. And I'm glad that I don't have to do that anymore. There's a lot of commands like that in the temple service. I'm glad that I don't have to go to a priest. I'm glad that I can just go to God, that I can go to him as a priest myself. I'm going through the high priest Jesus. But I'm glad I don't have to have a human intermediary, that I have my own special connection with God. But these expectations, you'll have no other gods before me, you'll make no idols, you'll have a special day, you won't take my name in vain, you're not going to murder, you're not going to steal, you're not going to commit adultery, you're not going to covet, you're going to honor your father and mother. These are all things that God still expects of us today. And note that what was put into the Ark of the Covenant concerned relationship. It was not the sacrificial system. It was the things that God expected in relationship to him and in relationship to other people. That was what was put in the ark to be remembered forever as this special reminder. That at the heart of these commands, there's a lot of, and I've got them in this in quotes, arbitrary. That is, things that God commands that, as far as I can tell, there's not like a specific purpose. Like blue and scarlet and a red yarn, or go through the tabernacle things. Why blue and red and scarlet? Well, okay, maybe it has to do with blood. He doesn't say that. Fine twined linen. I was talking to somebody the other day. They were listening to Exodus. If I have to hear fine twined linen one more time, I'm going to go crazy, because it's just over and over in the book of Exodus. Why that? Why that material? Well, I don't know necessarily that there's a reason for that material in specific, other than the question, are you going to do what God wants? Are you going to obey him? You don't really have to understand why fine twined linen. Are you going to do it or not? And while there's a lot of commands that seem to be in that vein in the law of Moses, the heart of God's law has always been the same. How we think about God, how we treat other people. That has been the same from Exodus to now. And really, even in the same in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs. How they thought about God and how they related to other people. That's the core, the heart of God's law. Not just God's law through Moses, but God's law for us. These principles haven't changed. He wants and deserves to be first in our hearts, and he's deeply concerned with how we treat our fellow humans. And so I'll end with Matthew 22, ironically not the Ten Commandments. Matthew 22, verse 34, if the Ten Commandments are a good distillation of the law of Moses into the most basic essence of the law, then Matthew 22, 34, which we have the two greatest commands, are even further distillation of the Ten Commandments. Again, separated into two categories. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands rest all the law and prophets. It's the same division we've already talked about throughout the Ten Commandments. The first four, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Have no other gods before me. Don't make any idols. Don't take my name in vain. Remember the Sabbath. Keep it holy. That's loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second six, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Honor your father and mother. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't covet. Treat others the way you want to be treated, right? The golden rule. This is the essence of God's law. And as we think about over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about the law in great detail. The great, not irony, again, the sadness of the law of Moses, they couldn't do it. And even today, we can't do it. Simple, even if it was just these 10 commands. Wouldn't that be in some ways kind of freeing if I didn't have to worry about all the rest. Even if it was just these 10, and that was the only commands God ever gave, you still wouldn't do it. I still wouldn't be able to do it. Which is why we had the sacrifices. We're going to sing There's Power in the Blood as we are offering the invitation. Even if it was just these 10, we'd still have sin, wouldn't we? We'd still have a problem. We'd still be separated from God. Even if we just distilled it down to these 10 commands, I still need forgiveness. And in the Old Testament, it was a sacrificial system. Today, we already remembered, as we're thinking about this special day of remembrance, as we consider the holiness of God, we've already considered what it is, right? In the sacrifice of Jesus, the Lord's Supper. Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in his blood. Not the blood of animals, the blood of bulls and goats, in the blood of Jesus. Because as we're striving to obey him, we do fail. Fortunately, God knows that. He knows we need redemption, and so he's provided